Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. You can also access our podcast at TheFederalNewsWire.com. My guest today is Dennis Unkovic, an international lawyer, author, business consultant. Over the course of his career, Dennis has advised corporations and individuals throughout the United States, as well as Asia and Europe, on mergers and acquisitions, supply chain issues, and international dispute resolution. He's traveled to 64 countries on behalf of clients and professional organizations, with a particular emphasis on the People's Republic of China and Japan. The author of 12 books and numerous articles, Dennis frequently makes presentations to companies, individuals, trade groups, professional organizations, and universities on a broad range of international business topics. He currently is partner at the law firm Meyer, Unkovic Scott LLP in Pittsburg, Pennsylvania. He is the author of The Fragility of China, Breaking Points of a Seemingly Invincible Regime. That is going to be the meat of our conversation and focus today. In that book, Dennis coins the term max trends to identify critical factors and developments that have potential to derail Xi's aggressive ambitions for China. These max trends include alarming demographic shifts, cracks in the global supply chain, an accelerating global arms race, and the Taiwan conundrum, all of which indicate that China's strengths may be more illusion than reality. He warns the world's democracies must take increasingly aggressive steps to exploit China's vulnerabilities if they hope to blunt Xi's ambitions. So with that, Dennis, I hope that's an adequate summary. Let's jump into our conversation. And as I warned in the pre-show, we'd like to talk a little bit about the personal background of our guests before we get into the substance of our back and forth. One of the fun things we tease folks with is when you were in that third grade conversation, your teacher said, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Did you say, "I want to be an international lawyer that writes about the vulnerabilities of the communist regime in China"?
Thank you for inviting me, Steve. And the answer is no, that is not what I did when I was in the third grade. I'm not even sure I can remember that long ago, but I've always been interested in international affairs. I went to the University of Virginia, which was a great school. And in my last year, I had a lot of credits. So I spent almost a whole year studying China and Japan, because this is back in the 70s. But I was thinking that they would end up being, Steve, an important thing in America's future. And I make a lot of mistakes in my life, but in this case, I was pretty much on the money.
Yep, I remember very, very well coming up through that period. Now, we thought at the time, many folks did, that it was Godzilla eating Manhattan and that Japan might be the dominant player in this. China might catch up. But I don't know that people really saw how big of a shift was going to take place over coming decades. But it created, as you get at in your book, an impression of China being kind of somewhat of a Goliath that maybe is going to have its way with the United States. Let's begin to talk a little bit about what drew you into writing a book, period, on this subject. Was it just one of those things where you felt like much of the world was getting things wrong and you had to speak up? Or did you feel like, I've just got a lot of life experience on this and I need to get a kind of a personal imprint on this dialogue that is running wild, really, in the United States and in major capitals?
That's a great question. My concern has been, by the way, between 1986 and 1992, people thought Japan was going to rule the world. And at that time, we passed a law called CFIUS, which we may talk about later, in which everybody thought Japan was going to rule the world. I didn't think that was true. And obviously, Japan has been not in a very strong economic position since the mid-1990s. But I have always had my eye on China because from the standpoint of size, it's significant. China has about 1.3 to 1.4 billion people. Nobody quite sure how many, but that's what it is. We'll talk about demographics later. But the Chinese are very hardworking, and I think under their current leadership, Xi Jinping, who has been in power since about 2013, you have a very strong leader in China who I think has his eye on being or making China the single most powerful political and military and essentially economic country in the world. And his magic date, as you know, Steve, is 2049. For your listeners or viewers, 2049 would be 100 years since Mao Zedong, 1949, essentially took over China, and the Communist Party has been in control ever since. So I just felt it was time to write a book about China. I can assure your viewers or listeners, I'm not very popular in China because of this book, because what we'll discuss later is I see China has vulnerabilities as well as great strength.
Well, let's start teasing apart some of those building blocks. I think I agree completely with a lot of the background on what the megatrends were and how they're perceived. And for a lot of people that have watched China's internal developments, there's kind of been this dichotomy. There's an element of it that is really of concern, but not necessarily the way it gets talked about internationally. And there's been a debate about engagement, which seems to be accommodation, versus confrontation. And there's a lot in the middle on that. And that's, I think, what caught my interest about what I think is the thesis of your book, is looking at a lot of these options in the middle that identify real trends and vulnerabilities that might give us better and safer options in containing the malign influences that we see there. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what some of these big trends are. You've coined this term max trends. Give us kind of a quick and dirty list of what you see as the core trends to look at, and let's start talking about them one by one to set our table for how we should be tracking what's happening inside China.
In my book, I have like 14 max trends, but I think there are 5 or 6 ones that are really sort of key.
Perfect.
The first one is demographics, which I think you'll probably be wanting to talk about. The next one is China's real estate crisis. It is significant, it's ongoing, and it's really affecting whatever Xi Jinping wants to do or thinks he can do now. They have a failing or a problematic global supply chain, which I think you might find interesting. If you want to talk about Taiwan, I call it a conundrum. I call it crazy things. But Taiwan is, I think, maybe the most dangerous flashpoints in the world today. One other thing we might talk about is how controlling the Chinese government is now for a foreign company doing business in China. You can either be buying and selling from China, you can have an operation there, you can have a joint venture, but the Chinese Communist Party has put massive controls, not over just Chinese companies, but really if you're a foreign investor there. So those are a couple of things, pick any one you want and maybe we can take it from there.
Yeah, well, a lot of these are of interest. Let's start with the demographics. I mean, that was actually part of the narrative that people have made for decades and decades about why China matters. You alluded to something that I often joke about, but it's not totally a joke. No one really knows what the true population numbers are. And it sort of falls into the big bucket of Chinese statistics where there's every incentive for the number to be big because they want to be number one. But who knows? There's a lot of Indians out in the world. There's a lot of Chinese out in the world. We know that it's big, but that is one of those things where people say, well, this is a population of such magnitude, we can't ignore it. Therefore, we should fill in the blank. But from your point of view and what you get into in the book, what's the real story, the Paul Harvey rest of the story on demographics in China today? We're past the couple generations of the one-child policy. We've got some other important things shifting there. Fill us in.
Let me, if I can, turn to the one-child policy for a minute. China in the 1960s was so poor that millions of people died from starvation. And there was a guy named Malthus who was an economist from the 19th century. And he basically said the world will fail because there will be too many people, there won't be enough food, and everybody will die. Well, obviously that didn't happen. But the Chinese, after going through starvation and problems under Mao, who I think was probably the worst political leader of the 20th century. Now, he had a lot of competition, but Mao was there. Mao put in this one-child policy, and a woman or a family was told, you may have one child, but if you have two children, you will be punished. Economically, you may not have a job. And that was put in really in the 1980s. Well, what happened was there were lots of external reasons going on here, but with the one-child policy, China, in fact, didn't have more than one child. And as a result, in 2023, last year, and 2022, the year before that, it's the first time when the Chinese population actually dropped. And I think the numbers, let's say 1.3 billion people. All right, that's how many they have. But it's a very serious problem for China because they have an elderly population. I don't know what elderly means, but let's say over 60. Because when you're in China, when you're 60 years old, you're supposed to retire. Okay, they're saying you're done. You can go. And if a woman has a blue collar job in China at 50, she's allowed to retire. And if a woman is working in a more not blue collar job, maybe 55. But now the Chinese see their population dropping. Why is this important? I saw a study recently that said by the year 2022, essentially 70 years from now, the Chinese population will be 700 million, or it's going to be essentially half, give or take, what it is today. That's a big problem for China.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about why it's a big problem. I mean, it should be obvious when people are watching trends like this, but we might as well say the obvious part out loud. Their population pyramid is upside down. They have a very broad top of that pyramid at advanced age. The middle-aged part of the pyramid is middle-sized and working its way up. And at the bottom, thanks to this one-child policy, and also just sort of modernization slowing down that incentive. I mean, you have people who live in small apartments that are provided by the government. And there's not out on some palatial estate where you can have 10 kids working the land. So you've got urbanization, small dwelling, low income, pressure of government policy. And you've got a small number of what should be family-aged people trying to sustain retirement and future social services for that big generation.
It's like a double whammy, Steve. First of all, there are not enough children coming in down here, but the people in China who are over 60, I'm over 60, elderly people, whatever, they do not have a social bottom like we do in this country. We have Social Security, we have Medicare. No matter what you think of those things, people at a certain age when they retire have a certain level of income. That really doesn't exist in China. So the Chinese people are expected to save. The other thing is, in the old days when people would have 3 or 4 or 5 children, this is back in the 1960s, if you got older and you're retiring, your family would say, okay, mom or dad, or come in and move with us or we'll help support you. That's not happening anymore. So it's like fewer people working to support this massive country, fewer younger people coming up. And at the other end, the people over 60 are getting older. That's one of the reasons China's economy, which used to grow, Steve, at between 8 and 12% for about almost 25 years, they'll be lucky to grow at 4.5% this year. Now, Xi Jinping says China will grow at 5% in 2024. Now, when you get to the statistics at the end of the year, Steve, they may well say China grew at 5%. But do I always believe the government-generated statistics in China? If the Chinese Communist Party says it's going to grow, it probably will. So as you said earlier when you asked me a question, how about these statistics? Can you always rely on them? The answer is not always.
Yeah. Well, you can rely on them saying that they're better off than they are. So let's just punctuate on the demographics. I mean, I think that there's also an analytical issue of the little emperor syndrome, when you have four grandparents, two parents putting all of their hopes and dreams on this one child. They don't tend to pour all of that in the hopes of that person being a human automaton on an assembly line living in very dystopian dorms in some megaplex that's in an export zone in southeastern China. They're hoping, in some cases, raising someone who wants to study abroad, wants to buy Gucci or whatever else. And so the unlimited supply of hard, cheap labor in China is also being affected in some ways by the success of the economic growth in recent years. It has to be a negative weight on those aggressive growth statistics we saw in the past. Does that jive with what you are observing in your research?
Absolutely, Steve. And there's one other thing. Chinese labor 35 years ago used to be cheap. In other words, if you got $1 in the US for an hour, they would get 20 or 25%. There is no more cheap Chinese labor. It's less than the US, but it's significant, which is one of the reasons why a lot of companies have decided, maybe I'm not going to, supply myself out of China. Maybe I'll go to Vietnam or somewhere else. And so the cheap Chinese labor of the past is not there, and it's fewer. There are less potential workers. And that's really a big problem for Xi Jinping, because he's saying, work harder, grow our economy. Because today, the Chinese GDP is about 17.7 trillion dollars a year. In the US, we're about 27.9 trillion dollars a year. So the Chinese essentially grew from one of the poorest countries in the world in the 1960s. And when they started under Deng Xiaoping and the predecessors of Xi Jinping, they have this great, and they do have a great infrastructure, it grew 8, 9, 10, 12% per year. But beginning in about 2013, that dropped off. And so the cheap Chinese labor driving a Chinese economy, it's really dropped off. One other, I hate statistics, but there's one interesting one. If you grow your economy at 8% per year, okay, over a period of 8.5 years, you double it. So the Chinese economy in the 60s was in the billions of dollars. Now it's 17 trillion. But it doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled again until about 2018, 2016, 17, it slowed down. And that's the problem China's facing. It's more expensive, harder to manufacture things cheaply, and there are fewer people to do it. It's a real problem.
Absolutely. Well, let's shift just slightly into one of the other big trends that you held up, and that's the supply chains. It's a major conversation that we're having in public policy circles. A lot of people have assumptions about whether we do or do not have options, and we've concentrated some critical supply chains in China. There are national security and economic reasons to look at diversifying, friendshoring, onshoring. Vigorous debate on that. But talk through a little bit about what's in your book about the reality check on where things are on supply chains in China, for China, and where you see things moving.
I think both under former President Trump and under President Biden, it's interesting. We're in the midst of a political election now, and it's Kamala Harris, but they're all fighting about things. But those two administrations both looked at China with concern, and I think that was right. We have national security interests that I think we need to protect. And so as a result, the ability to acquire things from China is becoming more difficult because we are blocking certain technologies that are allowed to go into China, which is one of the reasons about 2 years ago we put in the CHIP Act, because a lot of the most advanced chips in the world that are used for a lot of things, including AI, aren't sourced in the United States. They're not sourced in China. They're sourced in Taiwan, the Republic of China. But 80% of the really most advanced chips are there. And so the global supply chain was really hit in about 2020 when COVID came down. But before that, there were problems in the supply chain because Whenever there was a disruption of any kind, and we've had them, we're still going on today, is it easier to acquire something that is 1,000 miles away rather than something that is 12,000 miles away? I'll give you an example. Wuxi is one of the manufacturing cities in China. It's 100 miles from from Shanghai. If you call somebody in Wuxi and say, make me this, I have a pen here at the top of this pen, make me 1,000 of those. By the time they order it and put it together, it's a couple weeks. It takes a week to get to Shanghai. When it gets to Shanghai, it has to go through, custom clearance. You put it on a ship, a 40-foot container for anywhere between, 17 and 29 days. It arrives somewhere in the West Coast. You put it on a train, and eventually it shows up at your factory 4 months later. That's fine. I don't know, Steve, do you have a mechanical watch? I have a mechanical watch on here. It's the greatest thing in the world, but it has 120 pieces. When one of those pieces breaks, I got a piece of junk because it's just metal. The supply chain for 30 years worked fairly well because we didn't have major disruptions, but we don't need to talk about what COVID did to it. But even today, even there are announcements this week about maybe an increasing war in the Middle East. We know what's going on in the Ukraine. These are the things that are affecting the global supply chain. And I think a lot of American companies over the year weren't very smart. They said, where can I do it cheaply? Well, the answer is you could have done it in China or in Vietnam, but can you get it here when you need it? And a lot of companies, to their regret, found out that doesn't happen. That's what I talk about in the book.
Yeah, well, it does seem to be a mega trend of people coming to this awareness, now realizing we need to think a little bit more realistically about what resiliency means and what dependency relationships really are. And dependency on particular countries they're not all equal. So we might want to rethink on whom we are most dependent for what things. So
I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
Rich area of conversation. One of the other big trends that you had identified that I'd like to tease a little bit before we shift into, so what should we be doing differently about all of this, is the property market. It's gotten a lot of news and business reporting in recent years. There's been some big companies that have sensationally, Evergrande has been out there. Its Chinese name is ironic because it sort of means it's going to exist forever as it's visually collapsing. It's kind of one of those amazing ironies in reporting. But talk a little bit of it, because it's really hard for people on the outside to get a handle on how big of an X factor is this for the durability of the Chinese export model, of China's economic growth model generally. They seem to be committed to pumping money, and since they have an authoritarian government, they can sort of compel behaviors and changes in their system. How vulnerable are they on this, and how should we really get our hands on this trend?
Let me draw a little picture for your viewers, your listeners. In the United States, about 17% of our economy is based upon commercial real estate, residential real estate, okay? In China, it's almost a third, or twice what it is here. Now, in the US, if you're a successful person and you have a few savings, you can put it in the stock market, you can put it in a house, you can put it in various things in order to save money for the future. In China, beginning in 1996, for the first time, the Chinese people were allowed to buy real estate. Let me make it clear. The government still owns the real estate, but you were given like a 75-year lease on an apartment. So essentially, you owned it. For our purposes, you owned it. What the Chinese people did is they put almost all of their savings into real estate, because the stock markets over there are, let me put it this way, not a place I think you want to put serious money into. And the Chinese people know that. So they put a lot of it into buying a unit, oftentimes a small apartment, and that's where their savings were, 80 or 90%. Starting in the year 2020, about the time of COVID, the real estate market collapsed, and it has still collapsed. So imagine why, you probably wondered before, why if China was growing at 8 to 10% per year, why is it now 4 or 5%? The answer is a third of the money is in real estate. The average people, the Chinese consumer, is saying, oh my gosh, I've been losing money. The value of my real estate's been going down for 4 years. A lot of Chinese people put down their money and said, build me this unit. Okay. Evergrande, the company you just spoke about, went bankrupt. And at one point, they had overestimated the value of the company by about $200 billion. To me, that's a lot of money. Okay. But, and there are litigation now with their accountants and all the rest of that. But Evergrande was another one. You had Country Garden was another one, but there are all these companies that are bankrupt. And so what the Chinese government did last week, we're taping this today, they said, oh, we're going to lend you money so you can go out and buy more stock, or you can do this. The average person in China, the consumer, is a very small part of their economy. It used to be driven by manufacturing, making stuff and selling it. But the average person in China is saying, I don't see my money. I see deflation, not inflation. And so as much as Xi Jinping has been trying, Steve, to say, oh, yes, the economy's good, let's support and do this, it really hasn't been happening. And until that real estate situation turns around, it's in my opinion, I'm not an economist, but it's a multi-trillion dollar problem. And last week, China said, well, we might be investing up to $200 billion to help deal with this problem. If I cut your arm off and I put a Band-Aid over it, it's not going to help. And I think that's pretty much what you're seeing in China today. And so at the end of the day, real estate is the big drag on the Chinese economy. I see no improvement in the short run.
Well, I agree. It's a major, major factor. And it also happens to be something that is visual. You can literally see what's happening with it. So it's not one of those things that statisticians can just hide by some bookkeeping magic. So it seems like, I think, an important reality check on people's assumptions, including Xi Jinping's for a degree. So
and what you see, Steve, is millions of units unfinished. And one other thing is, you've heard of Shanghai, you've heard of Beijing, you've heard of the big cities, but they're third and fourth class cities, which may be 500,000 people there. They went and borrowed, the local governments, they're called provinces, states. They went and borrowed a lot of money and told their banks to lend. That's where a lot of these things are. And there's no quick fix to that because nobody there really wants the real estate. So this is a classic, serious problem for which there's no answer. That's one of the reasons you see declines in what's going on in China today.
Yeah. So with that, and I'll just remind the audience that there are several other of these major factors that they can dive into in your book. Yeah. But with that, let's pivot for a bit and talk about, okay, so what does this mean for the strategies and options that the United States, our allies, and others should be thinking about? So we're not in a world of the 1970s and 80s where there was just this opening and reform era that was talked about. Really, when you're coming out of abject poverty, government-driven poverty, there's only up to go. So there was going to be big growth coming out of those circumstances. We're not in those periods anymore. There's also a period when we were balancing against the Soviet Union, wasn't really focused on China in the same way. So we're in the Xi Jinping era. China is developed in a lot of ways, has some dangerous options, whether it's space, cyber, even its military modernization. It's not something that can or should be easily ignored anymore. It's picking fights with a lot of its neighbors, not exactly the peaceful rise rhetoric of the past. So with that kind of context, how should we be right-sizing what our option set is, given the trends you're trying to remind people? China isn't 10 feet tall and it has vulnerabilities. What are our options now?
Steve, you brought up many interesting points, but the one I want to touch on first is the military aspect. Xi Jinping, since he was in power in 2013, he's now in his third 5-year term, has been massively building up the military, particularly the People's Liberation Navy. All right. And if my hand here is China, and if over here is Japan, and down here is Taiwan, you have a thing called the South China Sea. And China has essentially tried to grasp that and say, this is my area and I wish to control it. Because if China's here, down here, you have Vietnam and you have Malaysia and you have Indonesia. And what they've done, the Chinese, is there are some atolls, like coral reefs, on which they put enormous military bases. And they are now, the Chinese, trying to interdict, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, the Philippines, everybody else from going through there. You're going to say, why do they care? Well, in theory, the Chinese are going to say, we don't want anybody going through there, so no one is going to block our ports. That's not it. About 4 to 5 trillion of goods go up here, through the straits and essentially go over to, North America, South America. The Chinese are now making it very difficult for people to transit that area. They are building up what's called a blue water navy. A blue water navy means a country doesn't just protect its coastline, but it can project power all over the world. There's only one blue ocean navy in the world today. That's the United States. We essentially have 12 or 13 carrier groups. They're all nuclear, and they're all over the world. What the Chinese are doing is now building their own carriers, and they're essentially using these bases, which are in the middle of the South China Sea, to saying, excuse me, this is my land. That's very serious concern. And so if I were, the Congress hasn't called me today, but if a congressman or senator called me today, either whoever becomes president, I would say we need as a country to strengthen our blue water navy capabilities. Because right now, as you know, we have problems in the Middle East. We've got the Ukrainian war, and, we have the West. U.S. cannot allow the Pacific to become anything other than the open ocean it is. So that is one thing that I think, as a country, we have to keep our eye on the ball. And the Chinese have also been building up their nuclear capabilities, and they have intercontinental ballistic missiles. But in the short run, do you want to have, going back to John Paul Jones, going back, 220 years ago, what the U.S. has always stood for is having free trade all over the world. You want to go somewhere, you go on the oceans. Unless you're 200 miles from the coastline, it should be open. That, I think, is the single most important thing in the short run that the U.S. Congress, essentially, because they'd have to appropriate the money, needs to do. And there are other things, but that was the first point I wanted to bring up.
Yeah. Well, certainly peace through strength is a theme that we've echoed over and over. It ought to be bipartisan. It also should just be common sense. It's certainly something that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and others have gamed out. They assumed that Americans were committed to that, and they had strategies to try to mitigate our strengths. But today we seem to be dividing ourselves. But today we're not focused on America's vulnerabilities as much. Let's zoom in a little on what some of the Chinese vulnerabilities are, so that, in times discussions past, people would say, well, you can't really deter China. It's just growing so fast, and the military modernization is so significant. America can't really keep up. We basically need to kind of come up with a new deal on what we're facing in the Pacific or elsewhere. And we've got to have this multipolar world. Okay, maybe. But your book is suggesting maybe this juggernaut isn't going forever. Maybe there are some critical areas where America and its allies could take options that may extend the period of time for us to kind of contain these malign influences. What say you on what, say, our allies in Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, others can be thinking and doing together with us, so that we're not at that sort of tipping point where it's just us versus them, U.S. versus China?
One thing I think we need to do, and this may surprise your listeners or your viewers, is to focus on Africa. What will be the largest population in the world in 2050? It's going to be Africa. And Africa, as we know, has had traditionally a lot of problems. But a lot of the key things we need, we can use lithium, we can do rare earth metals and all those kind of things. A lot of them come from Africa. What the Chinese have been doing is putting a full court press, to use my old basketball stuff, full court press on Africa, because they want to have control of the key things that come out of Africa. I think that's one of the things that not just the U.S., but that we need to take a better idea of. Lithium is an example of something that is not necessarily located in a certain part of the world, but where are a lot of these rare earth metals today extracted, essentially made pure so you can sell them? About 80% of it's done in China. So I think as countries in the West, we need to not only know where to source them, but how to take care of them. Another thing we haven't talked about is cyber. The Chinese have made significant cyber attacks on the US, as have some other countries. I think that cyber is an area where I don't know where the next wars or the conflicts are going to come from, but today we're on a video that we're doing here now. More and more of the world is going to be controlled by what you see and what you hear. And so the importance of cyber, to me, is something that I think the U.S. is working on, but it needs to be a higher priority. But the thing that's most important for the U.S. over the next 30 years comes in one word. It's called innovation. If you look at the world today, and 100 years ago, was a country rich? What did you look at? You looked, how much gold did it have in its hands or its things? Nobody really cares about gold today, unless you're investing in it. The thing that is moving the world today is technology, all right? 2/3 of the technology in the world today, this is Dennis's estimate, can't prove it, is probably Western technology, the United States and Europe. 1/3 of it comes from China. But what the Chinese have been doing is in 2015, they put in an initiative. It was called China 2025. So they looked at 24 or 25 key technologies, computers, all this other kind of stuff, and they've been working in those areas. The U.S. and the West will continue to be strong if they continue to innovate and control technologies. And what both President Trump did in his day and President Biden is doing now, and who knows who's going to be the next president, he or she or it, that ability to innovate and control technologies, in my opinion, is the single most important thing we can do. Are we doing a lot of that? Yes, but I think we need to do more of that, both on a private industry basis and as controlled by the government. 20 or 30 years ago, the US government used to do a lot of basic research. A lot of it was in the space area. A lot of people said, who cares? Who cares if you go to the moon? Well, the answer is a lot of those technologies that were developed then are driving America today. So innovation, continuing to out-innovate China, because of all the problems we've talked about today, there are more. Their currency is another problem we probably don't have time to talk about. But we have the ability to out-innovate, and if we do, that's sort of the secret weapon that I think the West can do to remain ahead.
Well, for sure. I think you've hit on that sort of supply chain issue in another way. If we're going to be leading, innovative, high-tech, export-oriented economy, you've got to have those critical inputs securely in your supply chains. You can't be dependent on your competition, much less a potential adversary in a time of crisis. We had a conversation in D.C. not that long ago with the governor of Alaska, who reminded the audience that if the United States, just got out of our own way and extracted and processed a lot of the materials that are just in the state of Alaska, not just the rest of the United States or our hemisphere, we actually have a lot of these rare earths and other critical minerals. It's really a matter of priority and policy, and that's what the U.S. and its allies could be cooperating on. So let's talk a little bit about the broader rebalancing of the economic relationship. One of the things we've had as an enduring theme in the China Desk conversations is the principle of reciprocity, whether it's a doctrine, an ideal, or what have you. In your thinking, in your book, or wherever, what role do you think that an idea of reciprocity can or should play as we think about rebalancing what our economic and other dependency relationships have been with China?
One of the things the Chinese have consistently been doing, if you had a factory that you owned in China, or if you're doing a joint venture, they would insist upon involving themselves in understanding what is your technology? How can I use this technology? In the US, we have either patents or we have trade secrets, but the really valuable things today are trade secrets, all right? And so the Chinese have been trying to extract as many technologies as they can from the West. And that is a real concern. Another thing the Chinese are doing is if you have a factory there, they oftentimes have a member of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, on the workers' committee, or they have them essentially on your board. And so I'm really concerned about the fact that until the Chinese are treated as they are here, and we're treated that way over there, we need to be tougher on dealing with them. And if that means less investment in China, well, then it means to be less investment in China. At the beginning of this interview, we talked about it's no longer cheap to do it in China. It's easier because they have a great infrastructure, but how much at risk do you want to be? There's one American company I know that needs a particular chemical for something that they do. They're sole sourced out of China. If that was cut off for any reason, then that company would have a very, very serious problem. And so, Steve, we talk about a level playing field, but the U.S. has never really had a level playing field with the Chinese. And so I take my hat off to the Biden administration and to the Trump administration for saying, look, if you're not going to allow this for us, we're going to make it more difficult for you to bring your products, on this supply chain over the Pacific into the United States. Now, nothing's perfect, and this isn't going to be a perfect thing, but the Chinese have to understand this time we're serious. And if you don't do it, you're going to see less investment. By the way, which country was the major importer of products into the United States as of this year? It used to be China. What is it now? Mexico. Is that something? That's a reshoring. A lot of the people over there reshore into Canada, United States, Mexico, the USMCA. And that's just an example of how a lot of companies have sort of already figured out what you and I are discussing today.
Well, Dennis, I think we're at the point of our conversation where we want to move a bit into closing remarks. If there's any parting thoughts that you have, we've just remind the audience, we've only really dipped our toes into the several analytical areas covered in your book. We encourage people to explore this concept of the fragility of China. But as we zoom out on this conversation today, where should people go to follow your commentary, your work, and of course, pursue a copy of your book?
Thank you for letting me make a pitch. My book is called The Fragility of China. Probably the easiest place to get it is on Amazon Books, or you can order it from your local bookstore. If you go into the Amazon site and put The Fragility of China or Dennis Unkovic, probably can't spell Unkovic, but on there, that book and my other books will pop up. And I didn't write the book to make any money, but I did want Americans to take China more seriously. It's not the biggest, most terrible country in the world. It's not going to defeat America. But if America doesn't take it seriously, the Chinese are smart, they're hardworking, and they're aggressive. And their goal is by 2049 to be the premier economic, political, and military power in the world today. I would like it to remain the United States. But I want to thank you very much, Steve, for having me on Federal Newswire. It's been an honor to talk to you, and thank you for the conversation.
Excellent. Well, Dennis, thank you very much for the thought-provoking conversation and excellent sum up. If you enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends. Consider subscribing and visit ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Dennis Unkovic for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.